Obsessions is quite a vast subject because it can have several origins, and what makes it subtle is that it's not necessarily egotic, because sometimes absolute consciousness can find itself wanting to play a certain way, and passions and obsessions can sometimes be synonymous. And there can be a potent drive to experiment something. It wants to experiment something, that's it. And it's not necessarily related to the ego. Usually you can spot an obsession related to the ego because it generally comes with a tension of some sort. And that's where we need to differentiate desire from envy. Yogis make a big distinction between the two. We are completely subjected to desire and we can't not satisfy it. If we don't satisfy it, we feel deeply frustrated. That's desire. About envy, it's, let's say you want to eat an apple, and if there isn't any available, doesn't matter. We can easily brush it off. You can't with desire. It's driving you mad. It's obsessive. When obsession gets very intense and you can't get rid of it, usually it comes from a compulsive mechanism of compensation, meaning you're using a pleasure, usually sensory, to compensate an emotion you don't dare to meet, or that you don't meet because you're afraid that it'll take up all the space if it unfolds. Usually, the basis of it all, what usually comes up during private discussions, is a sense of emptiness related to a lack of love. That's often what comes up, and that's what's going to be compensated by an obsession. The two major obsessions we see the most, as we often say, are either sexuality or food. Men usually turn towards sexuality and women usually turn towards food. Sometimes both of them can be present. Indeed, sometimes that can happen. Anyway, it is interesting to try and notice the moment this obsession shows up. If it spontaneously shows up, you'll notice that it always appears the moment you feel a sense of emptiness or sadness or feeling down. There's this feeling of lacking joy, and you'll compensate with a sensory pleasure, which is absolutely normal since our nature is joy. So obviously we want to feel that joy, so we will turn towards sensory pleasure for that. If you try and fight the mind, you'll never break out from it. It's impossible. You can't break out from an obsession by fighting it, by a sort of willpower thinking, I'll make it happen. Doesn't work. Or rather, you will succeed in one area and it will immediately engage in another. For instance, you'll try and control your desire for chocolate. You'll feel like you've dominated that desire, celebrating this victory. Yay, I've overcome it. Well, usually the obsession will move on to something else, usually something sweet yet again. Or, yay, I've overcome cigarettes, and you'll move on to chocolate, for instance. To truly come to terms with it, there's no other way than to look at what I call the underlying unsatisfaction, which is the emotion behind that compulsive behavior. There's no other way. So that sense of emptiness or of sadness or unsatisfaction, really, the moment the obsession appears, I advise to pause for a moment, maybe 5-10 minutes tops, and let that emptiness be embraced that uncomfortable sensation which lies behind the obsession. And once the satisfaction is transcended, the obsession won't manifest anymore. This habit that keeps on. I say habit because it tends to be stuck in a loop. But I do insist on the fact that obsession isn't necessarily negative. Exists an obsession, quote unquote, from consciousness which marvels at itself so deeply that it gets passionate. It happened to me after realization, for instance. I began having passions and obsessions about various subjects of all sorts. But it wasn't seized, hold on to. It wasn't bound. It was simply a passion like a child can be passionate about, I don't know, for instance, dinosaurs. Children have passions. They are spontaneously driven towards certain things. That's also the game of consciousness, marveling at all sorts of things. So we should be careful and differentiate the two. Another thing is, coming back to consciousness, comes a moment where after a succession of incarnations, even if in the absolute incarnation doesn't exist, but let's put it that way, well, some things haven't been seen in their entirety during, let's say, 5, 10, 50 lives. Well, in his present life, consciousness will create a sort of sense of hyperfocalization, of hyper-obsessiveness on something, to bring an intensity regarding introspection related to a specific matter, so that we go and investigate it properly. And in a way, consciousness won't let go of us so that we go all the way. Otherwise, it keeps on intensifying up to a moment where it becomes so unbearably intense that we have no choice but to go and look. We don't have a choice. So this obsession is created to enable us to resolve problematics. Okay? Something that hasn't been transcended yet in a succession of prior existences. Yet another game of consciousness. And most of all, at the risk of repeating myself, but it does worry people, you shouldn't judge yourself for having such obsessions and compulsions. It is here because it needs and it wants to be experimented like that. And that's okay. It has to go that way. For instance, food can be very obsessive for some people, but that can be a path to realization. Welcome to realize many things by varying approaches to food and by noticing what it modifies internally by doing so, by eating this or that. Same thing with sexuality. I know people who've been very bound to sexuality, people had during private discussions, and often men who've had many intercourses with many women. No judgment here, truly. Why not experiment it that way? Why not? But what's problematic, like Gerald was saying before, is that there can be lots of taboos around it, and we hide a lot of things, and we generally tend to lie a lot about it. And that's when it becomes much more uncomfortable. It complicates things. If it can be lived truthfully, it's rather easier and smoother. Absolutely. But we sometimes have to go through experiences of obsessiveness so that we can resolve them all the more, to transcend them all the more. That's it. We have to go through that. Nothing is in our control anyway, so it happens spontaneously. No need to feel guilty since we don't have control. Still, it's pretty much automatic, this identification of the character, playing the game of thinking, like, it's taboo, I know it's bad, but I do it anyway. I mean, it is all the game lying behind it to help you see more clearly, to clarify things. So it does follow the path. It must follow it inevitably, even if sometimes it takes forms and aspects that are Well, that may seem, due to our education, not normal, not righteous, dirty, unclean, etc. Well, remains the fact that it is following that path. Otherwise, we would have been led towards another path. If that's the one, that means it had to be done in that order. Speaking of which, realization is embracing everything, welcomes everything, and that's it. Which means that even this is welcomed and embraced. It's embraced. It's welcomed. There's no problem. No problem with that. Everything can be experimented. It's certainly not infinite consciousness that will limit itself with that kind of experiences. Especially since, if we're talking about the absolute, which it is, it doesn't experiment anything. So let's play. Long story short, obsession, when compulsive, based on desires, unresistible, etc., can only be transcended by presence and by the sense, the taste of love. For instance, even men who have a great deal of sex with lots of different women, in truth, they're not seeking sensory pleasures as the ego would have them believe, but rather the sense of or taste of presence. What they truly seek is affection and not something physical. Same goes with women and food. There's sometimes a sort of rejection, and they end up disgusting themselves for eating the way they do. All that usually refers back to some affect, to love, to presence. For instance, to both my mother and grandmother, the notion of love was passed amply through food, almost to the point where refusing their food meant I was breaking the bond of love. Eat. Eat. That's where the end of the problematic lies. It arises when the sense, the flavor of presence fills everything up. We go through all those experiences that we've been describing in those recordings simply to find our way home, because we've got the impression that we're not home. But the truth is we are here anyway. So we do all sorts of things to find a way back. That's what Pierre was talking about when he mentioned seeking affection. We seek the love of who we are. But that love is us. It is what we are. But we look for it through all that. And comes a moment when we realize we don't need all of that, because if there is a source, then we are the very source of that love, unconditional, infinite.